Okay, we've made it through parts 1 and we made it through part 2. Now we're in the home stretch, the last part of the list, and the 3 things that drive me the absolute craziest about the fantasy genre that we just can't seem to get away from. One of them is going to be opinion-based. The other 2 are ones that are genuine problems and really need to be addressed. So, are you ready to see what drives me the craziest? Well, I'm ready to share. Let's begin. This is the opinion one I mentioned. When it comes to fantasy, a lot of people will either go with the J.R.R. Tolkien route, well, at least try to, and try to make up their own languages when it comes to their cultures. That can be good, but you really need to know what you're doing. Otherwise, you're going to make up the most nonsense words that have nothing to do with each other, and your language will fall on itself and just collapse. There's no way to do it without causing yourself a lot of grief, unless you really know what you're doing. If you don't, then you really shouldn't do the language part. The other thing people will do is use a universal language. This is where I start having problems. A universal language is not possible. Even in this day and age, while we have languages that are common, we have no, and I repeat, no, double-handed for emphasis, no universal languages. English is a dominant one, but it is not universal. A lot of the Latin languages are very dominant. They are not universal. There is no universal language. There is no basic. There is no common. It is all, there are just many different ones that people use, and they will learn new languages if they have to, but no one just forgets their birth tongue. Now, a lot of people in fantasy seem to think that they can just make a basic tongue, and yes, I suppose they can. But what's the fun in that? You lose so much. You can have translators that can be either helpful and important, or important and evil as hell by screwing up messages for everyone and causing so much chaos. You can have the misunderstanding between translations, people who think they know the languages and don't. They can have the people who pretend to know the languages and make fools of themselves. There is so much you can do when there are different languages in the books, and you don't have a universal one. If you can do that, you can get so much more fun. And it actually makes it feel like there's a ton of different cultures instead of just cosmetic differences between the races and species and whatever else you're using. I mean, think about it. What kind of stuff could you do with that? I know I could do a lot, and I know I plan to do a lot. Plus, it actually makes the countries sound different from each other. I mean, how many times will you hear Old English stuff for humans and some weird language for the elves? It's just boring after a while. Think about it. Think about it and then try to use it. I wish magic. This is far too often something that will be the problem, the bane, the most god-awful thing about your fantasy novel. Because more than often, and not specifically the person that is watching it now, but all too often, a fantasy writer will make this great world, great character, great setting, wonderful plot, and then screw it up with their magic system. You want to know how? Fireball! Psh! Lightning! Psh! The actual spell? Good. The way of casting it? Bad! Here's the problem. When you just have the you wish magic, or a very unoriginal one like it, there is literally no cost to your magic, which means that it makes it seem cheap, easy, and whenever there's a problem that's not solved by magic, people wonder why. If there's a magician in your party, why didn't he just zap it? Oh, because he would get tired if he did it, but he would kill it, and they'd still be able to move on. Most people will just not have enough of a cost to their magic, or not make it interesting enough, not make it new enough to actually hold a person's attention. More than often, there's not even a system to it. It's not even explained. It's just said that they use magic, or that there was this internal energy pool. And it's not satisfying. It just isn't. If you're going to do a magic system, do one that actually has a set of rules. Do one that actually explains why magic works. Do one that is, most importantly, consistent. That is the big thing. You can't break your rules with your own system. The main character can sometimes get away with bending the rules, but you can't just snap them in two. Because if you do that, then no one's going to believe that the magic system makes any sense. And if people start disbelieving that, then you might as well not be writing fantasy at all, because fantasy is, admittedly, centered about magic to keep it different from other things. So, don't break the system. Break out of the system, but don't break the system. I think that's clear enough, don't you think? You'll figure it out. Ah! Well, we've reached the number 1 spot. And as you saw, number 1, the biggest bane of fantasy, the biggest cliche, and the biggest mistake that you can make. Mary Sue characters. I don't care if you call them Gary Stew for male. I don't care if you call them Marty Stew, Marty, whatever. These are the biggest problems that you can find in a fantasy book. And fantasy is the biggest breeding ground for this plague outside of fan fiction. Mary Sues are the worst things you can put in your book. Bar none, Mary Sues suck. They are an abomination. They are nothing more, they are absolutely nothing more than an excuse for an author to put themselves in a book and idealize themselves. Mary Sues can do no wrong like the Destiny Child. They have little to no motivation like the evil for no reason. They are pure good or are pure evil, depending on just how you see them. And more often than not, they ignore any system, any law, any sort of rule that you have in your story. They are the breakers. That's what I will call them from now on. Mary Sues are breakers. They break anything that's good. Most we found in fan fiction, they are an ever-growing plague in fantasy, and more of them are getting out into the published world. This is bad for the fantasy genre. We cannot let this keep happening. Original characters, original worlds, things that were born of imagination, of things that would normally be impossible, but in fantasy they are possible. That is the dream of fantasy writers, to create what could not possibly be made through science or in the future. That is the point of fantasy, to create what nothing else can make. Mary Sues break it, utterly and completely. The other cliches are bad, but this is the worst, for that simple reason. It breaks all of what fantasy is supposed to be. And those are my top 12 things in fantasy that need to be reimagined, rethought, or removed. And in the case of this one, obliterated. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your opinions on this. That would be all. End video.